Okay, we're live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. So this week we are talking about organized labor, and some of us read an article from history.com, which is basically just the history of organized labor in America. And we'll go over some quotes from the article, and if everything's working okay, you'll actually be able to see those quotes on the live stream. This is a new thing. Also, let us know if the sound is okay, or if there's an echo or something. I might have to disable one of the microphones. But yeah, so the labor movement is interesting because it's an interesting question why we've set up the labor market the way we have, and why we expect people to get their incomes from jobs, and why that's just kind of like the norm that we've established. And there are some things that are not the same everywhere. Like in countries all around the world, everybody gets their income from jobs, but then some people get their health insurance through their employer in some countries, and then in other countries that's all provided by the government and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting accident of history why some things end up being provided by employers and some things end up being provided by the government. And I think the labor movement has a lot to do with that. And I like to ask the question, does the labor movement make people better off? Does organized labor make ordinary people better off? Because as we know, most people are not members of unions, and this has kind of always been the case. But there are certainly, in terms of not just unions, but also kind of labor reform and that kind of thing, that can affect everyone. So are we better off as a result of having gone through this history? And I'm not even sure I know the answer to this question, but I'd like to go around the room, get people's initial thoughts on what do you think about the labor market, and in the world that we live in now, is it good, or how do you feel about it? And then in a world with basic income, how do your thoughts change? So we'll start with Steve.
Well, I think that the workers are better off because of the labor movement as opposed to nothing. But I think they would have been even more better off if they had a universal basic income. So I see in the quote there that one of the first efforts was to stop child labor. So they figured out a way for it to be okay for children to not work, but also not starve. But they just didn't run with that idea far.
Okay. Nick.
I guess I don't. I'll pass.
Okay. Elizabeth.
And so I think the labor movement is contribute to a lot of significant improvements, like a 5-day work week and no child labor and all those things. But I also take your point about the thing that you often talk about of the labor market is really inefficient because it's trying to do these multiple things. We're trying to get income to people so they can live through their jobs instead of just letting employers be okay, we want to incentivize people to match them with jobs. And so because the labor movement is operating in the people have to be able to survive on what they're making, and then you get these pushes for minimum wage, which when you are dependent on your job for your survival is really important. I think in a world with universal basic income, a lot of the stuff that the labor movement has pushed for and continues to push for would be would sort of happen more organically, that okay, you can't it's much harder to force people to work ridiculous hours. Well, you're going to work 80 hours a week with no bathroom breaks because it's the best paying job that you can get with your high school diploma or whatever, and you want to not starve. But if you're well, but I could literally not starve and stay at my house, then it's okay, if you want me to work 80 hours a week, you're gonna have to actually pay me real money. But given that people's alternatives to these terrible situations is usually starving, that then the labor movement is necessary to be okay, so starving is terrible, also these labor conditions are terrible, and we have much less power to fix the starving thing. So we're okay, we'll fix the labor conditions, but if the government just fixed the starving thing by being here's some money so you don't starve.
Yeah. Richard.
Well, in New Zealand, they're thinking about changing to a 4-day week, which means you don't necessarily need a union to decrease the number of days that you work.
And why is this happening? Why are they thinking about doing this?
Well, because it's been shown that people are more efficient when they have less hours work and fewer days work, and you don't really need to have as many.
I guess I was more curious about like who is pushing for it.
Oh, the prime minister is.
Okay, interesting.
And also, I think Finland is doing the same thing, or is it Sweden? I don't remember. And
labor movements presumably are very powerful in these countries, no?
But it's being pushed by the prime ministers.
But the labor unions could be lobbying, I guess.
Yeah.
Or you could even be in a labor party.
She.
Oh, she.
Yeah. Do you have any initial thoughts on organized labor? No, that's fine. Organized labor, its role in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the comments that you made. It does seem to help laborers get more rights and bargaining power. I think that's the main thing that it does. It allows laborers to collude against powerful firms and also become like a more collusive lobbyists. So those are the two things that it seems to do effectively. And historically, that seems important because firms have been like quite powerful, and other special interests have been quite powerful. But I agree that it's a bit of strange that like why it's like tied to work per se, and why like the form of collusion is around like working for the same industry or the same firm, and so tied to like the labor market. But I guess labor is like an important, has historically been like a key input that firms care about, and so it's kind of, it seems like an obvious way to like force firms to attend to like poorer people, because it's like a way that they have some leverage over firms.
Yeah.
And they can only kind of use that leverage if they collude.
Yeah. Makes sense. That's kind of the basic premise of it. Would you mind moving like closer to a microphone?
Not on the camera.
You're not going to be on camera. People are only on camera if they're like probably half of Nick is on camera. You won't be on camera.
I just feel bad for all of your viewers.
I know, right?
He's just an
You won't be on camera if you sit there either.
I will or I won't?
You will not if you sit at the table. You will not be on camera. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Initial thoughts
Well,
on
I feel like
organized
people have
labor.
covered it quite articulately. I guess one more like way to phrase it or frame it is that if you're just interested in like a utilitarian equation for social welfare, there are pros and cons that, especially in a world without basic income, kind of need to be weighed against each other, I suppose. So the pros are like helping the workers, helping the people, and the cons are sometimes it makes things more expensive or less efficient for the general society. And depending on if you're just like a strict utilitarian, I guess, depending on the size of the worker group versus the repercussions for the rest of society, like a utilitarian could go one way or the other with it. But one of the intriguing things that we talk about in this group is like, can you get around some of those trade-offs to efficiency by giving people bargaining power in other ways, as Elizabeth was talking about, or kind of trying to, as Mo was talking about, like decouple the power of people to have like well-being from the labor market and let the labor market be more efficient, which you talk about a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We can see all this stuff happening, in the labor movement and unions negotiating and strikes and all that kind of stuff. But we don't know what the counterfactual world would look like necessarily. I think it's hard to say what would have happened instead.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Which counterfactual? You mean if
A world without unions or labor movement or something like that. Like, what would that world look like? Would it just be
the U.S.
pretty close to So let me rephrase. Instead of a world without unions, a world without a history of unions.
Well,
Yeah.
China doesn't really have much of a union movement.
Okay. Well, there you go. They've also got other things that are different that kind of confound the thought experiment here. But yeah, or maybe some of those things are a necessary, consequence. But it is, the Communist Party in China, it's similar in some ways in that it's a worker-based movement. People organized around being laborers, and that's how they, kind of fought for, their rights and that kind of thing.
At least that was the propaganda.
I think it was true to some extent.
They're mostly peasants.
Yeah,
Like
pretty much.
self-sufficient farmers.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting how China was all like farm-based communist revolution, whereas Russia was like all city-based, and that contrast there.
Alex, can I back you up a tiny bit?
Yeah.
When you refer to this counterfactual, there's the obvious effects, which is like you would get rid of all the kinds of things that we've just been listing. Is there like a less obvious implication that you're trying to get at with this counterfactual?
So I guess the question is, if Adam Smith hadn't come up with, labor theory of value, and that hadn't been passed on to like Karl Marx and all of those people, would people, I think people would want, decent lives for themselves. Would they be organizing around this principle of like, we're workers, like that identity, and negotiating in that way?
Or would there be another one? I think is maybe Alex.
Or would there have been something else? Yeah.
Could you have gotten basic income sooner, or would there have been a whole different one?
Right.
Or, yeah.
So if I may, I don't mean to, if other people had, going back to an earlier comment that I made, it seems like this was an obvious one, regardless of like the particular ideologies. This seems obvious because it's especially after the Industrial Revolution, because it's like the one way to get at industrialists, and like an obvious way, like we're all like on the same floor of the same factory. Like it seems obvious that we could like collude to gain some power over the industrialist that controls the factory. Right. Or like if we're friends with other seamstresses in other factories, like we can all, we know each other, we do similar work, we're friends with each other, we can start to organize. Like it seems like a fairly natural thing to do once post-industrial revolution.
I think that's a good point. That is the power that they have, so they use the leverage that they're able to have in that context. Yeah.
But they had guilds in like the 1500s, and guilds are quite similar to unions.
Yeah, a lot of this actually, so the article gets into this a little bit, the difference between the labor movement and the guilds and the unions. Like they weren't always one thing. The
guilds also include the owners? Weren't they a mix of owners?
It was usually artisans and tradespeople who were in the guilds, and then that evolved into the unions. Then the labor movement kind of emerged from, like Moshe was saying, from factory workers in the Industrial Revolution and that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's interesting how those two things combined, and the article talks about that a little bit. So Derek has some comments on the live stream. He says, I think I have to give a thumbs down to labor movements. In the 1800s and early 1900s, as effects of the Industrial Revolution became apparent, there were inklings toward what could be called luxury movements or distributionist philosophies. These were outcompeted by modern socialists who emphasized instead the paramount importance of labor and production. It's hard to know what would have been gained if the former had succeeded over the latter instead. Yeah. I think Moshe's intuition is right, especially for the labor movement part, that if this is your life and this is the power you can exert in your life, that's kind of like a natural path. But if something else perhaps had been provided as a natural path, then maybe that could have shifted things. But this is like, even if just at like the intellectual levels we hadn't had these theories about labor creating all the value in the economy, the workers don't think about that. They don't care about that. They just care about what they can do to better themselves. So I think Moshe makes a good point there. Yeah. You guys ready to get to a quote from the article?
Yeah, I guess that we could just think later about whether the conditions that Moshe is describing are like still the conditions. Is that changing? Like, are companies less dependent on labor? Is that making a difference? In these dynamics.
I think that's a good point too, because I think workers have less leverage now than they did at the time when all of this was coming together.
Like if they could easily be automated and like the company's only hiring you because of a government subsidy or something, that's a very different power dynamic. Not that that's true in every company, but worth just considering, I guess.
Yeah.
And maybe the article. I don't know if the article touches on that.
Yeah, at the end it touches on a little bit Yeah, we'll get into it. So here's going to be the first quote, and let me put that up on the screen for our live streamers. There we go.
This is some new technological innovation.
Yes. So the labor movement in the United States grew out of the need to protect the common interest of workers. For those in the industrial sector, organized labor unions fought for better wages, reasonable hours, and safer working conditions. The labor movement led efforts to stop child labor, give health benefits, and provide aid to workers who were injured or retired. So I want to call attention to the first sentence, which is that the article assumes that there's a need to protect the common interest of workers. Like that is a fundamental assumption in this article. It's not protect, the interests of ordinary people. It's already saying like the identity as workers is baked in, and we need to protect the common interest of workers. So that's kind of, I think, a fundamental assumption of the labor movement itself and a fundamental assumption of this article.
I guess one way to talk about that is like what might have happened is coming out of Moshe's point about the natural power that people might have had, became this identity of workers being the people that everybody talks about as important or cares about as an identity, including in politics. Like that's how all the politicians speak. As opposed to speaking about citizens or people, you often hear this idea of workers, which I imagine kind of came from that situation. But it's very like predominant now. Yeah. I have one more little like side note. Child labor, I'm trying to think through whether it's the same kind of thing. It was interesting because like if you're not allowed to send your child to work, you can't make that money. But maybe that's something that everyone wants to be like tied to in order for like adult wages to go up and not to have to send your child to work.
And also sort of like treatment of like when you had like kids who were like chimney sweeps and being like, well, we're just going to send these like tiny monkey children up into like these chimneys where they're going to get like black lung and they're maybe going to like fall to their deaths. And like the ways in which we're like, I mean, there's obviously trade-offs that like people were sending their kids to work in factories and chimneys and whatever often because they needed that money, or the kids were like orphans and so they needed some money. But the sort of
no, there's definitely harm to the kids. That's not confusing me. It's just like thinking through, it's obviously a situation where individual parents before could have decided not to send their kids to work, presumably, but like they're kind of wanting to argue for it being a binding thing across the society. So I was thinking through how that might affect them to end up better off, not have the option.
I think that's a good observation, because obviously when child labor is allowed, then the people who are sending their children to work are better off than if they hadn't done that. But then if you just ban child labor altogether, now you're setting the rules equally for everyone.
And so does that actually make most people better off who were sending their kids before, because like wages go up for the adults or something like that?
I'm not entirely sure. And this is the American labor movement, but when you get into stuff like international trade, the countries that are able to provide more labor, like it's not, Moshe and I just came from a talk about international trade and globalization and stuff like that. It's not clear that if labor gets more expensive in one place, that those jobs just won't go to the country where it's cheaper or something like that. Yeah.
Maybe less true at this time of some of the labor. I'm not sure. I guess there was a lot of international trade even then.
Less true at the time, talking about in the article. Yeah, I think that's right. I think, even if there's technically open immigration and stuff like that, you've got these natural barriers like oceans and mountains and stuff, and you don't have cars. And
you're not going to like import from like 3 states over and be like, well, they let their kids do it for cheap, so we can just like make up the difference and like,
Right.
I guess this is also relevant to my earlier point about the bargaining power of the workers. Like the more globalized, the more it has to be like an international thing in order for it not to just be that the jobs go somewhere else. Or you have to lobby the government to like prevent international trade, and that's kind of, we see that too, but then that has inefficiencies for the everyday consumer too. So anyway.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff gets really tricky when this is the mechanism to get money into people's hands. You have to be a producer, so then you need to protect that. If you're not going to change that assumption that you have to be a producer in order to get money, then it makes things complicated. Yeah.
Just on minor side, it's kind of interesting that like nowadays, like we all see this like an obvious good that like there isn't child labor, or that you're not working like 80-hour work weeks or whatever. but I think that's just something that we've so much internalized because of the success of these movements. Whereas like I imagine 100 years ago it would have just been like no, like the same arguments that we give right now for like why firms should have a right to do things like lobby or find tax loopholes or something.
Right.
The same would have been said back then. And the only reason we're not saying this now is because they've succeeded so much at shifting the dialogue.
Yeah, that's a great point. They might have even said it was good for kids' work ethic. Or
Exactly.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard.
In Japan today, they have in the schools they have the students perform janitorial work, so it's just a relative.
Oh, we make our children work in all societies. It's just more kind of controlled, contained thing. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone have any more comments on this one before we move to the next one?
I guess this is such I guess we're just on the side of the child labor point, but I wonder how much of this also had to do with like, did the labor force actually start to require a more educated labor force? I mean, at some point, like there became more reason to send kids to school as opposed to just sending them to work right away. Like even if the conditions were safe or fine, we might want to send them to school to be educated for the job. Like the industry might have even wanted them to go to school. So I wonder how much. I mean, it sounds like the labor movement was the one pushing for this, but I wonder at what point it actually became beneficial for the companies to have like government subsidized school for workers to then be ready for their jobs.
It happened in 1911 where they had universal public high school.
Right. Yeah.
So the question is to what extent the political push for universal public high school was made possible by the changing economy
or by labor demands.
Or by labor
like was it more labor or actually something industry also
or
wanted?
To what extent labor demands were made possible or by the changing economy as well.
A third possibility. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
A third possibility, one that I know was important elsewhere, and I think to some extent our public education system, but I'm not sure it was the exact same push or how to delineate these. But we wanted to indoctrinate our populace into nationalistic ideologies, and that was often the primary push for like public education systems was to spew nationalism.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think that's one of the causes. I don't know how it compares to the two that you're mentioning.
That might have felt more urgent at times of like large immigration, which were also times of industrialization, right? So a lot of these, I don't know if that was part of the goal, but like you have all these new people coming.
So what was the nationalistic push in 1911? Like what was that about?
I don't know, and I don't know if it played a particular role in this that shift in 1911. I just know that reading about nationalism, that one of the things that nationalism often came with is like huge pushes for public education programs, and oftentimes that's how public schools spread, was because like there was a push by nationalists to use it to indoctrinate people.
That's because they're trying to do the whole melting pot sort of thing because there were so many immigrants in the early 20th century.
That was a thought I had too. Yeah, I don't know if that's true, but
it's also interesting that I think farm workers were kind of exempt from a lot of this stuff, including the child labor, right?
Yeah.
So you had, most of these people were black, right, and they were former slaves or descended from former slaves.
The farm workers or the city workers?
The farm workers, and the also the home workers as well were also exempt.
And shop workers.
Shop workers? Shopkeepers? So children could...
And like innkeeper children.
Interesting.
Okay.
It kind of seems... Yeah. Well, it kind of makes
What's the common thread?
It kind of makes me think of what Mo was saying about people's ideologies, though, too, because like all of these jobs, it sounds like a list of jobs that existed before the Industrial Revolution. So everyone's used to kids working those jobs. That's like fine. Like kids work those jobs.
But those are also the jobs where you can't collude as easily as factory workers.
Well, that's an alternative, maybe a better explanation. I guess I was thinking like it would have felt very natural and non-harmful for kids to do the jobs on the farm or in the shop that they've always been doing. But going to these factories and like getting coughs and dying and whatever like that, and getting caught in the machines and all this stuff might have seemed like a different thing that shouldn't be acceptable because it was new.
I like
and possibly more dangerous, but
I like Moshe's explanation. The ones who were able to negotiate were the ones who got the concessions. Yeah, and that includes not only people who are privileged enough to be able to work together and form a group, but also people who are privileged enough, to not be
That's fair.
a minority, that kind of
These
thing.
things might have worked
Yeah.
together, but another thing is like as a parent, as like a small farmer at least, I don't want to be banned. Like I don't see how it's going to come back around to benefit me if I'm banned from allowing my kids to work on the farm. Like I just have less free labor, or in my store, or in my restaurant. If I'm like the owner of the business myself, then I don't want to be. It's not like my wages are going to go up somehow because.
Well, if everyone else's children aren't allowed to work either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like then the yields are more competitive. You're saying, so maybe it would have
Yeah.
some of the benefits. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe that wasn't a factor, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's always going to be losers in policies like these. Yeah.
Even now, people's kids often work in. Is there like still an exception for restaurants and stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's still an exception for farm workers, as far as I know. Yeah. Okay, next quote. Or Moshe.
Sorry.
That's
I
all
don't
right.
mind if you go on to the next quote. I just I had another
Yeah.
general question. I don't know if you usually open it up later for general questions, but it brings
No,
us-
general questions throughout. Keep going.
If now's a good time.
Yes.
So going back to the it's somewhat general, but it also goes back a little bit to earlier discussions of other movements besides labor movements and other conditions before the Industrial Revolution. I guess I was just wondering, is it always the case that the lowest echelon of society who became the factory workers or the agricultural workers, are they always kind of kept at subsistence level? Have there been times when they've been actually able to bargain their way out of that, or through other movements? What other exceptions other than labor movements have we seen, like the lowest echelon actually being able to kind of do
So
well?
I guess the question is, I mean, there's always going to be a lowest echelon,
Yeah.
right? So maybe the question is about economic mobility, like maybe there's turnover in terms of who's in the lowest echelon, or
No.
Or do you mean like raising the standard of living more?
Yeah, I mean, was there ever a case where the standard of living wasn't subsistence level for, say, the bottom 50% of the population or the bottom 80% of the population, or is it just always pushed down to that by market forces until you have
Like pre-labor unions, even?
yeah,
Or,
exactly.
Oh, I see. That's a good question.
Was there anything like labor unions that was able, or other movements that was able to get the bottom 80%? So sorry, I just want to finish articulating the question.
Yeah.
That got the other that 80% of the population to get better living standards.
It's a good question. Yeah.
Richard?
After the plagues and there were fewer decrease in population, like 50% or
Yes.
and so I've read that they were able to double their wages afterwards for
There you go.
a number of decades.
Plagues.
Maybe wars can also have a similar effect.
To be fair, I think that it's true that it has that effect of increasing wages. But I think, going to my point about being pushed back to subsistence,
Right.
my sense is that in those cases, at least, and I think it's on the same podcast that you listen to, the government just instituted a law that said, actually laborers can't move, and so therefore they can't renegotiate their contracts, and so therefore they're stuck at the low wages. So it was artificially kept low.
But I'm not sure that stuck forever, because then there were more rebellions against that. I don't remember how it all.
Right, I agree. I don't remember how it all played out, but my sense is there was certainly an attempt to maintain the minimal standard of living.
And I guess the movement at that time was violent uprising, which happened quite a bit.
Yes, but my understanding is they failed.
What is the motivation for maintaining that minimal standard of living?
Well, he's wondering if just market forces just do that.
Well,
I mean, the market is determined by the institutions that set the rules for the market as well.
Yeah, and in this case, it wasn't just the market forces would have caused wages to go up, as
I see, right? Yeah.
as Steve was saying.
Richard.
So it's not just market forces; it's the political forces.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Yeah.
In China, there are rebellions all the time, but they just aren't publicized.
If they won, they'd probably be publicized.
I guess one answer to your question then,
Yeah.
in like that case is like the noblemen
Exactly.
didn't want to lose their
Exactly.
labor or have
Yeah.
to pay more or whatever.
And I think that's kind of a narrative that we continue today. At the same time, when the capitalists and business owners aren't really depending that much on labor as much, but we still maintain this narrative of they want to keep, or not everybody maintains this narrative, but I've heard this narrative that the business owners want to keep the workers poor, so they keep working and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
Well, in
I
this
wonder,
case- sorry.
I wonder if that's just like left over from before, or why that's still a common
In
narrative.
the case that I'm talking about,
Yeah.
and it's just
Yeah.
one anecdote, so it's worth knowing if other people know of other examples.
Yeah.
But and the case that Bethany also learned about through similar sources, in that case, it's not like the noblemen were purposely trying to bring the standard of living down. What they didn't want to do is have wages go up, and they therefore didn't want free mobility because they knew that would mean they'd have to pay higher wages. So it's not like if somehow the king was willing to, like, using his own money hand out money to all of the peasants,
Yeah.
the noblemen would have had a problem. It's just the noblemen didn't want to have to pay higher shares of the crops,
Right.
And so they therefore wanted to restrict mobility to reduce the bargaining power of the labor.
So ultimately, they didn't. It's not like, oh, we want these people to be poor. It's, oh, we don't want to pay higher wages.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That seems like, I think that's still the current narrative, right? Like companies don't want to pay any more than they have to.
That is
Or maybe
true.
there's more sophisticated narratives than that. That's the one that I would usually
No. I mean, I think that's true. And then if we associate people's incomes with jobs, if we still have this strong connection,
Yeah.
then it still feels like the businesses are pushing for people to be poor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that you have thoughts about how, like, in other ways, the government kind of props up wages. But I don't know if that's why you're asking this question. I'm not sure. That might be a red herring. I'm not sure where you're going.
What was my question again?
Wasn't it like, why do we still have this narrative?
Uh-huh.
Or like, you seem to be implying that there was like, the narrative didn't maybe fit anymore.
I see.
I kind of think the narrative is a criticism, like coming from the left. It's like saying, "Oh, they're purposely keeping us here." Whereas
Oh,
I
I
kind
see.
of think, like, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I kind of think it's not that, like, they're purposely keeping us here. It's that there's selfish actors trying to reduce the payouts, which happen to have the effect of keeping us here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Bethany's right too. The fact, I think our economic policy, because we're thinking of people as workers and we're trying to boost wages, create jobs, that kind of thing. It kind of reinforces this identity of people as workers. Yeah.
I guess, I don't know if this is relevant to Mo's question, but after World War II, there were like a lot of social programs that like superficially seemed like just to be like morally justified. Somehow people were okay with like government programs rewarding veterans. I don't know if there's more to it than that I just don't know about. And that's post-labor unions. But it seems like a boost a lot of people got that wasn't actually directly related to labor unions per se.
So there is more to it, and the article actually talks about this.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and one thing is that it wasn't universally celebrated. Like, there were people who were worried that, oh, the GI Bill, people are going to come back from World War II, and then they're just going to be lazy. There were a lot of people who said that. Yeah. So,
Lays around.
yeah.
It wasn't even just like free money though.
It was free education, free housing.
Yeah,
Free education,
okay.
free housing,
That's what I
and
had.
unemployment benefits
yeah.
as well.
Oh,
So that's what they were kind of thinking of as free
I
money,
see,
I think. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's also interesting. It doesn't explain why the people were in favor of it, which I guess is what I was kind of
Yeah,
more
I agree.
interested in.
Why the people were in favor of it?
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like they had more bargaining power, and yet somehow.
Yeah.
Presumably, but people kind of got behind it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how that got passed. And
Yeah. It's a good point.
We
Yeah,
just defeated the Nazis, and it's like we feel like really good about like all of these men who are coming back and they're going to take all those jobs that you women had, and like we want to like prop them up and be like, okay, they're super great, like they should be the ones.
I think certainly at this point in history, we were thinking more about macroeconomic policy, like how to get the economy going, that kind of thing.
interesting.
So it was thought of as a stimulus package?
I think it largely was, yeah.
Interesting.
How do you get the economy going again? How do you
But
keep
I
it
guess
going?
in terms of getting the public on board, like voters and stuff, I suspect that part of what Elizabeth is saying made a big difference.
Yeah. But like there were a lot of people who were worried that after World War II, after the war ended, oh no, we're going to be in a depression because
We
we're
just
not
had
going to
the
be
Great
producing all this
Depression
stuff
before,
anymore.
and then we needed this.
People were worried we were just going to slide right back into that.
I think it was part of the Square New Deal, which is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to pass, but he died before it. And so, have you heard of the Square New Deal before?
I don't think so.
Well, it had like universal health care and things like that in it.
Okay.
It was like the next generation of the New Deal.
Like phase 2?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
What about the progressive movement? Do we have any idea why that was able to succeed?
Well, that was earlier in the 20th century, or late 19th century, right?
1920.
Early 1910s, 1920s. Yeah. Why was it able to succeed? I don't know. I guess the most I know about it is from when we listened to that podcast about the history of the Republican Party. So I don't know. Like it started as a split from the Republicans, right? There were the progressive Republicans, and then they came into challenge, and I don't know. They had different things that they wanted.
But it seems as though this wasn't tied to like labor colluding. This was just the fact that like a lot of the lowest echelon people had the vote, and they were somehow able to successfully use that to their advantage.
From 1900 until the 1920s.
Yeah.
But I wonder how they were able to collude so effectively.
Good, like, right. Question.
How the workers were, or how the
Party.
the progressive.
The party as a whole. Like, why weren't the like business tycoons just able to like keep them down the way that they had been up until?
It's a good question.
And seem to be doing fairly effectively now.
In the 1930s, there was a threat of communism on the West Coast. So they
On the West Coast.
Chinese immigration?
No,
It was before that.
communism and socialism and whatnot. And so the business leaders, needed the aid of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to stave it off so they can continue with capitalism.
That's a little bit later, though. I mean, the question is about the progressive movement, and I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to
Because
that.
that is another kind of power. It's like voting bloc power,
Right.
obviously, and people use it more or less successfully at different points.
I know that at this time in the labor movement, they were trying to very much be apolitical and not associate themselves with any party.
That's interesting because that obviously changed over time.
I think there were kind of like socialist political movements and stuff like that, but the trade unions and labor groups were really trying to stay separate from that, and that did change over time.
I guess one more like potential downside to unions is like they can have an incentive to keep the people in the union as small of a group as possible, so that can also be an incentive to like exclude. This is a separate point, but like exclude other people from accessing the union, which can be bad for those people.
I think that's right, and there is kind of this effect of it protects the people in the union, or protects the jobs and the working conditions of the people in the union, sometimes to the exclusion of everyone else. And I think this is part of what separated the labor movement from unions and the trade guilds and stuff like that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
But the labor movement was mostly pushed by labor unions, or was it?
No.
Okay.
They were actually very much
At odds
with each other
So
for a
how
while.
was who was the main base for the labor movement?
So the labor movement it started with the factory workers, kind of as you described.
You mean even non-unionized factory workers?
Yeah, the labor movement, they didn't really have, well, that's a good question. I'm trying to think about the order in which things happened.
Because I would have, my guess, and I haven't read up on this, would have been that the unions would all collude with each other and be like, okay, we need to get better working conditions.
So I think at any given point in history, there was never like a majority of people that were in unions, that were unionized. So that includes most factory workers and et cetera. Yeah.
But to effectively lobby, you don't need a majority. You just need to be like very collusive.
Yeah, but my sense was that it was different organizations that weren't the unions at first that were pushing for the labor movement, and it might even have been coming from fueled by philosophers or something like that.
Christians.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Have you heard about the expression of redneck? That was actually they had coal miners and things wore this red handkerchief to signify that they were in a union.
I always thought it was because they got sunburned on their necks and
I
they were
thought that
farmers.
too, yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
Maybe not, though.
Okay. Elizabeth will look it up for us.
Yeah, you guys are doing fact checking over here.
All right. Let me move on to the next quote here.
That was actually Michael Moore documentary.
Oh, really?
Mentioned that.
Okay.
I haven't seen that.
So here's the next quote. I guess I'll highlight it here. Local craft unions proliferated in the cities. No, it's got that thing. No, whatever. Local craft unions proliferated in the cities, publishing lists of prices for their work, defending their trades against diluted and cheap labor, and increasingly demanding a shorter workday in the face of the Industrial Revolution.
Is that being shown on the?
Yes.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
So does that mean they colluded on price?
It does mean they colluded on price.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're essentially kind of controlling this resource of labor and saying, you're going to pay us what we want, otherwise we won't, or whatever.
It's interesting because now I think we associate we associate different groups with different things. Like we associate collusion among big companies with controlling of price and the people who think that is bad are generally the people who think unions are good.
I mean, I think we generally describe both sides as doing this. Like whoever has the power to collude is gonna try to set the prices if they can, and then if you're on the side of labor, it's you're doing it on the labor side so that the businesses can't keep wages down, and if you're on the business side, whichever side you're on. Yeah.
Well, with businesses, it's like with the airports and things, airlines. It's illegal to do that, but with workers, it's well, for the most part, it's allowed.
Okay. Yeah. So as far as what this quote is talking about, they're talking about the Industrial Revolution affecting skilled workers,
right.
Craft workers. So they're worried that their crafts are going to be automated or that kind of thing.
How would these things deal with automation though? Because if it can be made by a factory, that's not covered by their craft union, is it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they're trying to defend their trades. They're trying to defend their trades against the factory workers that are replacing them. The factories and the factory workers that are replacing them. So here's another.
And also, there's uneven quality between different workmen.
Yeah, I think this is a common argument that's made for trade unions, is that you want to pay the extra price because we're going to ensure that the quality is good. We've vetted all our people and yeah.
They offer extra service.
Do you know how these craft unions actually maintained, prevented other people from taking over the trade? Did they have unique knowledge or unique skills that they weren't sharing, or was it just a brand issue?
I think that's part of it. They had unique knowledge and unique skills, and they did have this kind of filtering system where they'd make sure their people were trained and vetted and that kind of thing. So you knew what you were going to get if you got it from a union.
The American Medical Association is kind of like this, isn't it?
It's a union. Yeah.
Yeah. So it does this, and it does it because we want to trust our doctors. I guess that's how they maintain the power.
I think there's some debate to be had about I think we could use a lot more doctors, and the American Medical Association is.
I'm not saying they're only doing good for society. I'm saying how
do
do they
get
any power? Why don't we just say we don't care about the American Medical? Right. It's because they vet. They have a whole.
Just to be clear, they weren't it's not. I don't know. Maybe you or someone in this room does. That was a grassroots collusive movement among doctors, or that was like the government set that up?
I actually don't know.
I
That's a
think
good
the
point.
doctors lobbied for the rules that set those boundaries.
Right.
I think it's a similar situation like with
The
plumber workers and
Right.
license for becoming an electrician and or like a barber. I mean the regulations controlling who can get a license to cut hair are
Right.
they're really heavy, and I think they're mostly about protecting the
But they do
income
have legal
of-
backing, I guess.
Well, right, but I think that that those protections. I mean, one of the strategies is talking about how they're defending their work against diluted and cheap labor. I think that one of the strategies, at least up until this point, or that has gotten us where we are now, is to lobby the government to erect these barriers.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the arguments that presumably has some effectiveness is this idea that you're protecting the consumer from bad quality or things that are unsafe, right? Like that's the argument they would make,
Yeah,
I
right,
assume, is
right.
that like has to have like
You might
sanitary
get a
conditions
rash.
in your, yeah, right, exactly.
The libertarian argument is that you would ward against that with word of mouth instead of like regulations.
Yeah, I think that works. That kind of effect is real as well.
With like Yelp and things like more nowadays.
Yeah, certainly today with Yelp, if you're a restaurant and you get a bad review on Yelp, that's
And it it's tricky too because there were also real issues with, I think there were real issues with like food quality and all this kind of stuff not being regulated. So it wouldn't seem like a totally uncompelling argument to have some.
It seems
yeah.
like it's a big issue. With food, it was definitely a big issue, and I imagine similarly with medicine, bad doctors.
Yeah.
And like it seems like it's in general going to be a problem for reputational systems to work when you don't have good information
Right.
access. So like
Exactly.
it's very hard for me to know what's in my food.
Yeah.
It's also very hard to know if my doctor's remedy is a kook remedy.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
instances like that, you need something to help with the informational problem.
Yeah,
Now,
that's right.
it need not necessarily be government regulation. It could be some kind of like third-party like oversight that's an independent branding agency or something like that. But there is a real informational problem.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That's a good
Like
point.
there's this guarantee type thing on like electrical cords and things. I
Yeah.
forget what it's called, like the UGL or something like that. But you can like they certify it so you can like bite it and it'll be fine and things like that.
Yeah, UL.
Yeah. UL, what does that stand for?
Underwriters Laboratories?
Something
I
like
could have
that.
been chewing on the wires this whole time. That's what-
So then it's like safe for children.
No, I obviously
Yeah.
I'm making a joke. Yeah, that's
So I guess the question is, to what extent is that a real, solving a real informational problem, and to what extent is it the right? Exactly. Yeah.
Both, right? I mean,
And it's usually some degree of both, right?
Like maybe
Yeah.
the rule, like the regulations aren't as efficient as they could be because they're also achieving this other goal of like
And
keeping
as with
the
any monopoly,
process.
you're going to restrict supply.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and it's like your trade-offs of like, well, okay, like how many kids do you want to like die of like the faulty electrical wires before you're like, all right, cool. So like that was enough word of mouth that now that company is out of business,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we've all switched to the one that like doesn't have children dying.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a question with wages too. Like, to what extent are the wages in place because they're a necessary incentive to get people to do the work, and to what extent are the wages in place because we've set things up to make sure the wages are at a certain level that the workers can get a certain income, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also the like, and thinking about the sort of like, information and like switching costs and stuff that like, if you have certification, whatever, such that like you basically can't sell electrical wires that kids can bite through, then you don't have to worry about like, oh, okay, so like everyone knows like that they should use like, you know, this UL brand, but this other one is like 50% cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And so like if you're trading off of like, well, I need to get an electrical cord and I also need to get groceries and I don't have enough money, like I can get this cheap electrical cord and hope that I can keep an eye on my kid. So like maybe there's enough of that like the cheap electrical cord company stays in business and so doesn't fully get like pushed out by even like good information. And so then it's like, well, then who's responsible for like these children who are still dying, because it's like, okay, like, should we be solving that by like forcing out this electrical cord company? Should we be solving it by like giving people enough money to like buy proper electrical cords? Like, whose responsibility is that?
These are all really important questions, and I think part of the answer to this question is has to do with when are we going to expect people to take risks that are in expectation going to be harmful to themselves or something like that, or so this is, it's a little bit like an insurance question. Like, people don't necessarily plan for a fire to burn down their house, but they should be protected against it. And if they had to decide on their own, they might not spend the money or something like that.
The flood insurance type of thing.
Or flood, fire, whatever insurance. Yeah.
But Alex, to ask it in a way that's not quite an insurance question, I think this also gets back to another question by Bethany, which is, suppose that the laws changed in the U.S. now so that actually you're allowed to sell all your organs, like it's illegal to sell your organs. Okay. The question is, like, would it be the case that in, say, 20 years down the line, let's assume that everything in the economy stays the same, there's no automation or stuff like that. So things are constant except this one legal change. Okay. Would we find that in the poorest parts of America, people are still eating unhealthy food and working 2 jobs and also now lacking kidneys?
Like, would their lives end up strictly worse off?
Exactly. And my guess is, I guess I don't know enough about how macroeconomics works to know for sure, but my intuition says yes.
Yeah, that's my intuition as well.
And so that suggests that it's not so much a self-control problem, but or maybe it is, but it suggests there's something about the market dynamics that causes people to be about as bad off as they're legally allowed to be.
And I can't quite wrap my head around like how that works.
I agree, but it seems to be true historically.
Well,
there's always a huge fraction of the population that's like kind of at the legal minimum.
So I think it's a little bit like inflation. If everyone can sell their organ now, it's kind of the normal thing that you do. Here's an analogy that might actually kind of shed some light on this. Is that it used to be that only the men were working. Then all the women entered the labor force. Were those households better off in the end? Yeah. So same kind of
like
thing.
They're not wealthier in terms of
they're not wealthier, right? Like women have more freedom and rights and everything, but everyone's still roughly as poor, right?
Yeah. But that one makes more sense to me because you can directly think about like a price of labor. Like it's like the reverse plague. You've got like double the labor, so the cost of the labor should go down.
But you're still able to produce more goods, so you might think that.
Right. I mean, isn't it true that? I mean, maybe it gets down to the question of like, well, what does it really mean to say that the standard of living is higher?
Yeah.
But I mean, we do have stuff that we didn't have.
Yeah, that's why I said holding constant automation as well as technology. Like I want to hold that because that stuff will obviously change a lot of things. And in my thought experiment, I kind of just want to change this one law, then let other.
Right. But I guess I'm wondering, like, are we somehow actually getting more, like, with the women working because we are producing more stuff, even though they're like, I'm not sure. Is the buying power actually higher?
So here's a way to think about the kidneys. Here's another way to think about the kidneys. If you sell your kidney and get the money from that, say it's structured as kind of like a overtime thing or something like that. Now you have access to more money, so now you're potentially willing to work for less because you're not as desperate for the money from a job. You're potentially willing to work for less, and then that can kind of balance out a little bit.
So you could end up better off, and I think that would be like the libertarian way of thinking about the problem, which is like, okay, so maybe people don't have kidneys now, but they chose not to because they prefer to have more free time, and they're trading their kidneys for free time.
They're renting them
But the
out.
people who really needed kidneys are much better. Like,
I agree.
They're not dead.
I agree.
But I'm also thinking that the wages that people are willing to work for have decreased. So maybe the specific people who sold their kidneys are better off on average, but now the people who didn't sell their kidneys are worse off on average because the wages that are available to them are lower.
So he was actually
like that.
supporting your point about how it
Yeah.
gets down, because like they're
Yeah.
assuming like without a minimum wage,
Yeah.
I guess, or something like
Right.
that. That's already
Yeah.
below. Like if they're
Is
not
your-
already at minimum
Is
wage.
your question like? Are you asking? Is the
I just
kind of baseline level? I mean, however, I mean, there are going to be people way out on the fringe who have had terrible luck and are
yeah. I don't
living
mean
on
the,
the
I don't mean the
street
bottom 1%. I mean the bottom 50%.
yeah. Okay. Is the question you're asking? Is the kind of quality of life of the people of the kind of median of the bottom 50% or whatever determined by like the law and this kind of
Yeah,
safety
yeah,
net
that's
that
right, that's
society puts
that's
under it?
That's right. Yeah, and I kind of have the vague impression that that's like historically always true, and hence the only way that they could improve their law is to like effectively collude to like change the law. Yeah.
One, I think it makes me think of maybe another sort of case that is easy to think about or something. I saw this, I think it was in the New York Times within the last few months, a kind of documentary about a shanty town in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of saying like, wow, we're really not used to seeing urban shanty towns like this.
Skid Row thing.
And then they compared it to one in Mexico somewhere, where it's sort of kind of a normal thing. Like people are, finding a odd shaped lot next to the train tracks that they can. In the case in Oakland, it was sort of not a big piece of land, but people had sort of filled it up with vans and cars and RVs and were living in it in pretty bad conditions,
Right.
and there have been several fires, like people had been burned out of their RVs because of electric heaters or whatever, and one takeaway from the story was this is normal. Like lots of people living in these kinds of conditions is totally taken for granted in Latin America in most places.
Yeah.
Right.
There are big, lots of shanty towns. So it's almost like the exception is highlighting the rule. Like we don't have a lot of that in the U.S. or we haven't.
Right, and so like, why is that?
And
Sort of
why
part of
is
the
that?
question.
Is it just because like building codes are enforced more
Right.
rigorously,
Right.
or like we effectively have building codes? And I kind of think maybe that is basically the
Yeah,
answer.
it could be.
Yeah.
I think that the alternative possibility is that the labor force here has more market power because the labor market is somewhat local, and the capital is more productive here, and you put more productive capital with labor, it makes the marginal product of labor higher, and so the wages are going to be higher. Some kind of, I can imagine some kind of argument like that, maybe, but I'm not sure which is playing a bigger role. But if you removed all the labor laws here or all the housing regulations here, would it start to look like these shanty towns in Latin America, or labor markets start to look like they do in China? And I guess I don't know.
I think there's an important question here that we've been asking, which is what are people able to do to improve their own lot? And then the other side of that question is what can society do to improve the lot of people kind of from the top down? And then how those two things interact. Like lobbying is the interaction of these two things, right? People improving their own lot by lobbying for it to be improved from the top down, right?
Or striking, or rioting, or
Sure, any kind of negotiation that gets the system to do something different.
I guess part of what I was taking from Moshe's question, which does kind of come back to the labor unions, is it just that like a greater percentage of the U.S. population is more similar to somebody in the U.S. who doesn't really rely on any of these rules? Like there are people in jobs where the labor rules don't touch them. They're above minimum wage. They don't work in a unionized job. Like most of the regulations are kind of irrelevant because they have like a lot of other kinds of bargaining power. Like they have a special skill and they get to decide like, I won't work for you unless you entice me with like all these extra things that maybe the law doesn't even require. Like have to cover my egg freezing. You have to like give me a gym and a coffee shop and the place and a chef. And there are people in that position where like their quality of life is not really that relevant to like the floor, right? And so I guess I'm trying to think through: is it partly like, is the question like, are there more people with like skill in that way somehow in the U.S. so that you wouldn't have the same percentage of.
I mean, I think that's definitely true. But I also just wonder among the like laborers in the U.S. if they also just again like inherently have higher wages or better living conditions because of the fact that like they're being paired with more productive capital.
So I'm skeptical of that perspective because I feel like when we look at the macroeconomy as a whole, the more productive the labor is in aggregate, the less it's going to get paid because you need less labor to produce the same amount of stuff. Does that make sense?
Well, that seems independent of like demand going up.
Yeah, I think there are many assumptions built in. I agree that that's sometimes going to be the case. But like so for instance, imagine that like what we have in the U.S. is a bunch of like fancy restaurants that sell steaks to rich people. And we obviously can't have Chinese immigrants coming by the day and leave in the evening to just serve these hamburgers. And so you need to hire local people to do that. Because those hamburgers are so valuable to the rich people, and you need so many of them served, that's going to inherently lead to higher wages than if you're in a country where they don't have these fancy restaurants, you just have McDonald's.
So I guess what I'm wondering though is like you'll be willing to pay more, but then but what makes the person demand more? The employee.
The employee will always demand as much as they can get.
But if they're in competition with other potential employees, is that part of the question? Like, wouldn't that lower their wages anyway?
Yeah, I think I don't know. Yeah, you're
for
right.
the expensive.
I don't know exactly how this will work, but I guess it's just not immediately obvious to me.
I mean, this is not macro, but for the expensive steak restaurant, if what you're selling is an expensive steak, you're willing to pay the high price for the worker and just find the very best worker.
Well, the skill thing is relevant, right? Yeah. But that's kind of what I was bringing up, like how much of it is skilled labor. Right. And I guess if you combine that with higher profits, then you are willing.
I mean, but I guess if I wonder, like, suppose that like all the like production facilities in the U.S. were high-end stuff, so that like if you. Well, I don't know how to make it sound.
I think I'm trying to understand though, like if you combine that with some bargaining power, which could come from like skills being relevant for all of these jobs or something like that, you should get higher wages.
But maybe not. Maybe the workers are screwed either way.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you assume that all the consumers are rich, like richer than the workers, then the workers then what are the workers consuming with their money? Where are they? Like it doesn't kind of add up in the whole economy. You know what I mean?
Maybe they're like a bunch of rich Russians that buy all this stuff. I don't know.
So you could imagine a city
to Abu Dhabi.
Right.
There they are.
So this is a good example where the workers are not consumers within the city.
Correct.
Yeah. So they're consuming from abroad. So I guess that's the.
Yeah.
But
that's interesting.
So then you could have a situation where because the city is catering to the wealthy, that does drive the workers' wages up, but it's still like they're a different class of people.
Like the workers in Abu Dhabi, my impression is that
no, because they can get plenty of workers. Yeah.
Right, and
so there has to be some bargaining power with. That's kind of what I'm saying. The workers have to have something like scarcity, skill, and then they can drive the wages up. I think.
Yeah.
Well, but I'm not sure. I mean, Beth, you were saying there are, imagine a worker who isn't affected by these legal boundaries that set where the bottom is, but I'm not sure that. I mean, even though they're not, their situation isn't directly.
Yeah, is it indirectly?
Controlled.
It's a good question.
It could be indirectly because, like, imagine if you took away all those laws and now suddenly, like there are shanty towns everywhere and people living under bridges. Now, I mean, maybe it's good enough. Maybe it seems really good now. Forget your egg freezing and chefs. Now you're
trying to just not live in a shanty town.
Have an office that's heated.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, and I haven't really like.
Well, I think it's true that if you don't have a minimum wage, then workers will bid wages down to compete with each other, right? Like that's that's something that happens.
Right. And then also at the top end, I think, there's like, let's say the most highly sought after workers, how high that bidding can go also depends on, how profitable those.
Yeah, that's kind of like Mo's
Corporations
point,
are.
I think. Yeah, that's
And
that's
we see this with like companies like Google that want to hire specific people who like they're the only person who could do that job because it's something that's like tailored to them, and then they pay them very high salaries.
I'm
and
thinking like
stuff that.
professional athletes too. Are
Professional. Oh, that's
like,
even better.
They
example.
want like
Yeah.
the best athlete.
Yeah.
They'll pay them like a huge
Yeah.
amount
But
because they're also very
yeah.
profitable.
My current impression is, and again, I could be getting the economics of this wrong, that if you don't have a specialized skill and you can't collude to exclude other laborers, then you're just going to be pushed down to like minimal like sustainability,
Right.
minimal legal standards.
Unless you have some other way of
What about like
negotiating,
scarcity of workers though?
So there's-
I guess?
So there's colluding with workers to put pressure on the employer, and then there's colluding as citizens to put pressure on the government, right?
Yeah.
So these are kind of two different
And
things
then
also.
there's the federal job guarantee, which is the government providing an alternative to private labor.
That, yeah, I mean, that's something that's been proposed. It's not something that's ever existed.
Well, back to this question of
Like
like,
in
if
Saudi Arabia, 70% of the jobs are like federal job guarantee.
Okay. Go ahead, Nick.
Going back to this question of like, what would happen if we took away the regulations and
Yeah.
there was competition, kind of race to the bottom in wages? I think it reminds me. I think Marx had this theory, which was like, what the bottom is the price of labor will go down to the replacement value of the labor. Basically meaning, enough, like just enough for people to not starve
Right. Yeah.
and have enough children
Yeah.
to replace themselves. And so
Oh, that's interesting. He added the second generation
Yeah,
in
that's
there.
interesting.
I
That's
wouldn't,
what he
have
means
thought
by
to, I wouldn't have
replacement.
thought to do that.
that's what it means by like sustain the population.
I see. So his definition of sustainable is good enough to reproduce.
Yeah.
I don't think he's framing it as a good thing, though.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think whether I even think that would happen because that requires some foresight. I mean, I'm trying to think of what the floor would even be.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure.
Well, I think like at what point would the wages be too low for you to go to work?
Yeah.
Like if they're not enough for you not to starve,
Right.
then it really doesn't matter, right?
So-
if I'm going to starve in the next few weeks,
So I might as well
I
not.
might as well lie around. And
So I want to point out that this is something that basic income changes, right?
I think we all agree with that.
Yeah.
It seems pretty
It
obvious.
changes it in a couple of different ways. In that some jobs people might be willing to work a tiny amount that wouldn't sustain their replacement in the Marxian sense,
Or they would start on it alone or something.
or they would starve on it if that was their only income. Like it makes that possible. But it also means that for other less desirable jobs, the workers won't bid each other down to kind of the subsistence level anymore because they'll be like, well, that's not really a job I want. So then the reservation wage, so to speak, would be higher.
But I think
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I think maybe another argument in favor of UBI in terms of this discussion
Yeah.
is to the extent that we're right or Marx is right if he said this earlier, that like the average labor will be pushed down to like the minimal sustainable levels.
Yeah.
Like then like to the extent that you don't have UBI but you rely on like jobs and the labor market to like provide for people, you're just always guaranteeing that they're screwed.
You're either guaranteeing that they're screwed, or you're doing things that will distort the labor market to push the wages beyond what's necessary to incentivize the labor,
Which is hard. Like
which
we
is what
talked
we
about.
do.
There's like globalization issues then, and
Right.
there's like inefficiencies
Right.
in the market, and there's
Right.
and people are left out of it.
And yet they
Yeah.
still seem, they're maybe not in shanty towns and maybe not have child labor, but they're still pretty screwed.
Yeah.
Like maybe these kind of second best solutions that you're describing, which have their efficiency problems,
Yeah.
like they're still not doing that great of a job.
Right.
Like they're still leaving the average American in a
Yeah.
pretty shitty spot.
Well, it's a very elegant, like, having cash already as a floor is like a very elegant way to have like bargaining power and
Right.
deal. We've talked about this in here before, and like deal with a lot of the concerns. You don't have to regulate like each possible. I mean, there's still information problems, but you don't have to regulate like each possible violation of quality of life or like every aspect of a market and like try to compete with foreign workers. And you don't have to like deal with all these things in a patchwork kind of way.
Okay, okay. I'm trying to imagine maybe what a Marxist would say, and I'm not sure I have this picture right, but I mean, maybe they would say, yeah, I mean, they're screwed. I mean, building codes and work week limits, those all actually work to raise people's standard of living.
Right.
But maybe Marx would say, like, that just makes it more expensive for workers to be able to replace themselves because they don't have a choice to just live in a tent. They're now being forced to pay rent. So that raises the wages, but still you wind up basically kind of, there's a tendency for the baseline wages to kind of go down to where you can just get by. So I wonder if that would still be true as long as the UBI is less than that sort of subsistence.
I think that's right, that if the UBI is less than that subsistence level,
that's not helping too
then
much.
wages are just going to go down.
And people are going to be just as screwed.
Because I mean, I think
I want to push back on this a little bit because we mentioned that the average person is pretty bad off under the system, but it's not just that. It's that there are some people who are left behind entirely. There's some people who kind of fall through the cracks. This is why we have something called a safety net, right? So if there's a basic income, then there's not just going to be. There might be people who are still left out of the labor market. Even if the basic income is low, if it's higher than zero, it strictly makes those people better off than they would otherwise be.
Those people are just the 1% of homeless or whatever. Like you're still leaving behind the 30% of people who are living at poverty.
So,
like if you're talking about a $12,000 basic income, like the 30% that are at poverty, I guess this argument would be that they end up still at poverty.
like their wages go to zero almost.
Well, not zero. Like
whatever
poverty
it
is
would
like 40,000 or something. So the
Is
wages.
for two people.
I
Or
think
for one
so.
person?
Yeah. Or
It depends on where you live. You can live on 12,000.
well, whatever. Call it whatever number you want. Let's talk about.
So long as this number UBI is less than that number.
All right, sorry, I shouldn't get hung up on the specific
Okay, so
numbers.
this gets to something that for some reason I always think about.
Yeah.
Like maybe we should make it possible for people. Maybe we should make it possible for people to maybe we should figure out ways to reduce the cost of that baseline.
Living expense.
Like maybe we should get rid of the building codes.
So, I think that's an interesting question. I want to remind us that ultimately the economy is constrained by resources. We only have a certain amount of stuff that we can produce for people, services that we can provide for people, and maybe we're not activating that full capacity now. But if we end up in an economy where the highest basic income we can achieve is very much below subsistence level or something like that, then that means there's not really a way to improve things.
Because you're saying then we're at a resource constraint.
Right, then that means we're kind of at a resource constraint. So maybe you could get some efficiency by deregulating certain things, maybe looser building codes or other things that really don't need to be regulated. Maybe break up some of the unions or something like that, allow the labor market to be more efficient, then maybe that allows us to raise the basic income a little bit or something like that because it unlocks more productive
I'm wondering
capacity
if
in the
your
economy.
view of how you would ratchet up the basic income to the highest sustainable level, maybe that kind of addresses Mo's point, because I'm trying to think of the dynamics of it, but maybe if it was too low, like such that wages were just coming down to meet it, you would keep raising it until you reach the kind of productive capacity.
Right. I mean, if you're imagining a world in which kind of like the natural maximum sustainable level of basic income is below subsistence level, then there's not really that much we can do to improve things.
Yeah.
But I think we have an intuition that we live in a world that has the resources to end poverty.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
My criticism is only if we do, Yang's basic income.
Like you pick a number and just
Right, and that number is like fairly small. Like he's talking $1,000 a month. I think that's like my guess is like that number wouldn't actually do much.
Yeah.
So-
I mean, it is it is actually like the poverty level, basically. So the poverty level per family of 4, the federal guidelines for 2019 is about like 2,600, and you add or subtract another like 4,420 per member. So that gets you, I didn't do the exact math, but it gets you roughly down to 12,000
Yeah.
for one person. So you're basically at the federal poverty level.
So maybe that's still effective.
I think the impact of it would be huge. And it's important to remember that the basic income isn't just like you're getting this instead of a job either, right?
He's worried about the wages.
He's worried
going
about
down.
the wages coming down. And I think wages would come down in some jobs. I think, especially if the spending from the consumer spending from the basic income is high enough that it causes the Fed to want to tighten monetary policy, that might, eliminate jobs and stuff like that.
But even if you're not like eliminating jobs, it seems like anybody who runs a McDonald's would now, instead of offering, if we
It
still
would
have
have
the
to
same
literally go to
Sorry.
0 for me to not be
I
better.
agree. That's why I think at poverty would still have some effect.
Yeah, and like I have to spend all my time at McDonald's. Like I might choose to live at the poverty line.
So-
Many people
Okay,
might choose that, which gives them
I
like
agree.
bargaining
So long as
power.
it's at this like.
I think you have to be able to live.
No,
and
but
then
I mean,
say
like,
no.
I think even
Yeah.
half that level would have a substantial effect because everybody has money to spend, and that creates, like if I want to make money, that creates more opportunities for me to make money too, because now, all these homeless people over here in this shanty town are potential customers, right? So I really think it changes the dynamics.
So
of
you're
things.
saying like the even the people who like don't have any job now and now have like this small amount, like that would drive other effects in the economy, kind of.
You
as a
could.
stimulus?
I think we've talked about this before. Maybe when we were talking about the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, how they introduced this income into the communities, and now there was this couple that just started making soap for all their neighbors and selling the soap, and then they were able to have a business because all their neighbors actually had money now when they didn't before. That kind of
In
thing.
Africa, that woman who created those small loaves of bread and all the people around had money to buy those.
Yeah. And those people also can potentially, they now have it's not just like, oh, now someone's getting the money from people. It's now people actually have an incentive to produce real stuff in their community. Yeah.
What maybe this is a different discussion, but what prevents the value of the basic income to plummet? Like if everybody
Like inflation, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you should read my CMT article. But
say this for a different conversation.
but the intuition is just that prices are stable when the flow of consumer spending matches up with the flow of production in the economy. So same amount of money going towards same number of goods.
So I
that
think
kind of
when
thing.
Alex said if we're up at a resource constraint, like then you could try to pump more money in, but you just get more inflation.
let me finish this. So in order for the economy to function, there needs to be some level of flow of consumer spending going towards the economy's production. And the idea when I talk about the natural level of basic income, that's the level of basic income that gets the flow of consumer spending to the level that it activates the economy's production without going over.
Let me ask the question
Yeah.
slightly differently.
Yeah.
What if we change the laws to allow everybody to sell kidneys?
Yeah.
As in the previous thought experiment.
Yeah.
How is that different from providing a universal basic income that's about the same value as my second kidney? In that, like, now I basically have an extra $40,000 because I can sell my kidney. And it seems like that should be as effective as giving me a basic income. But we previously had the intuition that it wouldn't be, that like somehow like the marketplace would screw me over enough that I'd be at about the same place but one kidney less.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Why did we have that intuition?
Yeah. Well, it seems like it contradicts.
But I think part of it is, in the case of the kidneys, is that suddenly now there's a huge supply of kidneys. You might not be able to get very much for yours.
Right, but it's the same with basic income. If you hand out a basic income, now there's a huge supply of like money that there wasn't.
So it's a little bit different because the money can buy anything in the economy. It's a claim ticket on any good or service in the economy. Whereas the kidney, it can only be traded to someone who wants a kidney, and there are only so many people who want
So
that.
assuming in the kidney thought experiment that it only happens to like a sufficiently small fraction of the population that it doesn't change the kidney market per se.
Right. So assume that you're going to be able to get the same amount of money
I'll get
per
$40,000
kidney.
for my kidney.
So I think the reason why I had that intuition is partly because I was imagining the kidney sale as a one-time thing, and I wasn't imagining it as providing you exactly the same amount of money that you would get from.
One time. Oh yeah.
I wasn't imagining that the price of the kidney would somehow be calibrated to whatever amount of money consumers need to activate the economy's full productive capacity.
Also,
I think if you had a kidney situation where everybody sold their kidney and everybody got exactly enough money from that kidney for their, over the course of their life, they're able to purchase collectively purchase the full production of the economy, then everyone would be better off. So here's another way to put it. If you're taking one of everyone's kidneys away and you're providing them with a basic income, then you're not going to have the problem.
Yeah, so then I guess the question is like, what's causing the nonlinear effect? So why is it that when you only give people a small fraction of the basic income, it doesn't work, but when you give them the whole basic income, it does?
It's less about it being the fraction, and it's more about it being a one-time thing, I think.
Well, but before in your thought experiment, you allowed the payment for the kidney to be spread out over 40 years. And
Okay.
you still had the same intuition that would lead to the same problem.
No, this is a good question.
I don't even know what intuition I have anymore about this kidney thing, to be honest.
Yeah.
I know.
So my intuition, I don't think there's a nonlinear result here. I don't think that's something that's happening. I think there's a problem in our thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
scientists are actually creating mini kidneys and mini livers.
It's going to take away my kidney purchasing power.
Worthless, and that's why it's not going to work.
Yeah.
I sort of think that
Yeah.
our intuition about kidneys is probably right. Like I still believe that intuition that that it wouldn't like suddenly make people better off. But and I think that people do transfer that intuition to the idea of basic income and just because you hear a lot of people say, well, the landlords just would raise the rent and it wouldn't do anybody any good. It would be right back where you started. So, but I think that it is, maybe thinking about this more would help us convince people, like if we could help people dispel that wrong
So I have an idea.
intuition.
So I'm thinking about why women entering the workforce had this effect where kind of everyone roughly ended up where they started, or households ended up roughly where they started in terms of their level of wealth. And I think that had to do with driving down the value of labor. If we're creating a thought experiment where the thing that people are selling and getting revenue from for the rest of their life is not subject to these kinds of market forces, then you don't have this problem. Does that make sense? So if instead of women entering the workforce, we just provided money to women or money to households, then you wouldn't have this problem because that income kind of stays where it is. It's not subject to the market saying, oh, now there's less labor or something like that, or now there's more abundance of labor. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does. I'm just not yet sure I share the intuition, which is, I think about, I don't know, so legalizing prostitution.
Sure.
Like that's also a case where I don't think it's gonna water down the effect because of the way labor markets respond. I think the amount of money you get from prostitution isn't gonna mean that all of a sudden the entire labor market is gonna wages are gonna go down across the labor market. What will happen is more women will work in prostitution, and with kidneys, they'll have more money at first, but then slowly their lives will become about as bad off.
There's also I mean, there's also a lot of other positive externalities with legalizing prostitution besides
Oh, I
the
agree.
income.
Yeah,
but-
no, that's fair. I didn't mean this to be a taking a political stance on prostitution, but I do think one of the reasons why people intuit it, and I agree, it shouldn't be like dispositive or the full story. But one of the reasons people intuit it's wrong to legalize prostitution is because we have a similar intuition that like, oh, at the end of the day, the women are going to end up as, like, poor women are still going to end up as bad, just now also having to sell their bodies.
You know, I don't have that intuition.
Yeah.
I don't have that intuition for prostitution.
Yeah, okay.
I'm actually
Yeah.
kind of like losing my. I'm really losing my sense of
I
intuition.
mean, my intuition would be
I
that,
don't actually know
that you'd
'cause
be
I
able
don't
to, you have
understand.
stronger bargaining power because it's legal now.
Oh, I agree. That changing from legal to illegal. I agree. My thought experiment, I guess, is best served by having not actually effectively killing the market versus enabling the market. But
I mean,
you're
I guess
right now we still have a
you-
market, so it's just like an unsafe market.
So my intuition is that now they have more choices about where they want to work, what they want to do with their labor. Maybe more women going into prostitution even drives up wages in other markets because they're losing all of the women.
Yeah,
they need,
now I'm
you know,
thinking about
Yeah.
that effect. Like,
Yeah, 'cause a lot of
you're
women will
making
go into-
labor more scarce in
Yeah,
other
every
fields.
woman wants to be a prostitute.
Well, because women will go into sex work because it has flexibility.
Yeah.
It's like, I can make more money than I could at McDonald's in fewer hours.
And-
I'm able to be home with my kid more. Like I can flex my hours.
And the customers, the clients are often people who have more money that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been spent back into the productive economy.
so
So,
maybe
it's almost
it's
like a
important-
redistribution scheme.
Maybe for the
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually saw a documentary on YouTube about how there's these prostitute cities in India, I think, that there's a number of them, and they actually have higher wages than they have in certain where they're spread out across the city, certain cities.
That's interesting.
Is it polluting?
Is that the reason?
It's because there's you can have how do I say it? There's
Returns to scale.
no there's truck drivers that can stop there because and there's different
I see.
choices there. There's
No,
there's
that's
this
kind of- yeah.
petite woman here and there's this large woman there and there's
I would have actually thought the opposite
Yeah,
because
I
I would have
also
thought
think the
now
opposite.
if they're spread out, they're like in each place they're
You
more
have
scarce.
what's called a local monopoly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's interesting. If they're
Yeah, but which makes
Yeah,
me
but if
feel
you're-
that they must be colluding.
If you're all in one place, then you're attracting all the customers to that place. That can be a pretty big effect too. Like the Pokemon Go effect, where everyone goes to where the gym is
Yeah.
and that kind of thing.
But
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting example. But I think something that might be messing with our intuition a little bit on this, and maybe I should clarify because I think I had a slightly different thought experiment in mind than what's coming in your guys' minds, which is I think it's worth delineating the part of the market that would be served by people who don't need to go into this industry versus the people who are forced into it based on need. And because I think the intuition about being pushed down to sustenance levels only comes when you're in the need-based category. In that, for instance, if you and I had to sell our kidneys, I don't think our lives would be as poor off as not, just like with that thought experiment.
right.
And so I think many of the examples that you guys had in mind was people who have decent jobs, but now they can do this, they would then have fewer hours and high-end clients. I think that's kind of applying in the thought experiment this idea of people who are not already at sustenance level, whereas I have in mind more the Les Miserables story, which is if you guys remember there, it's a woman who's completely at sustenance level,
Right.
and now she has a new opportunity being offered by prostitution,
Right.
and so she gets some money from that, but then in several months she's, because say the people who are extracting money for raising her daughter just start raising the price because they're cool, she has a windfall of money, let's ask her for more, and so then now she's got to give more to the point where she does have a venereal disease, and my intuition is more you'll see that kind of stuff. But maybe and obviously that kind of dynamic only worked because she was totally dependent and able to be extracted from, which wouldn't have.
She's also totally dependent on them.
Right.
Uh-huh.
I mean, this is
I agree. Yeah, so it's not so obvious that it would generalize, but
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends on how you legalize it, and then how you're going to regulate it, and what you're going to enforce and not.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
yeah.
Another example that I feel like is sort of in this, that people talk about quite a bit is Uber, Airbnb. That seems great at first, but then pressure, this same pressure that pushes people to back to subsistence means like, great, like now you have to spend your spare time driving Uber and have some stranger sitting on your couch. Sort of just to get by.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I think part of the reason that it's true is because these kind of gig economy things are getting around negotiated regulations that were in place before.
Right, they're like eroding the floor that we've been talking about. That's set by these
But
rules.
and it's a framework that's put in place through labor movements and unions and stuff like that. So I don't think it's inherently It's a tricky thing because I mean you're basically removing the labor protections, kind of is what you're doing. And maybe you could even think of women entering the workforce as analogous in the sense that we've removed this, protection, this kind of social protection that says only half of people have to work or something like that. Yeah, like a cultural thing. So I want to kind of shift gears to another question, which is, I think it's clear that when workers have power over their employers, they can exert negotiating power and collude and get more of the things they want. The question is that when people are negotiating with the government or lobbying the government, why are they doing that in the capacity of workers? And why are they asking for the government to set things up so that the employer pays them more or treats them better or gives them better working conditions? Why aren't they going to the government and saying, hey, we are your people, we demand rights from you directly? Why are they saying we want to make employers do this?
Would an example be like better health insurance for my employer versus like health insurance from the government?
Yeah, or basic income instead of minimum wage.
Right.
Yeah.
But they do see, as I think Bethany was implicitly alluding to, they do seem to also request things directly from the government, like Medicare, universal health care, things like that. Like those are things that people are demanding.
Yeah. Although, like, only recently has universal health care gained traction, or like
Here.
Exactly,
in the U.S. for some reason. I mean, obviously not.
But it's still an example, and not a unique example of something that's not just demanded with respect to employer, but with respect to from the government.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, like, which things are the things that we like? Really, it's really like a which things question.
Yeah. And I think this question kind of gets to the issue of, it made sense historically that you'd negotiate with your employer or collude against your employer, but that logic doesn't explain why we're still fighting for rights in terms of labor rights.
Do you think part of it is like the unions are still quite powerful in their own right, and so like you can kind of buddy up with them or like use some of that power?
I mean, I think some of it is kind of where we've got this path dependence on labor being the source of people's incomes and labor being the source of people's health insurance, which didn't happen in other countries.
It seems to be something else. Sorry.
Actually, the health insurance is like a cyclical thing. Like in the 60s, universal health care was popular, but Ronald Reagan was actually an actor who was in these commercials that was really effective in fighting against it. And then in the 70s, with Nixon favoring HMOs over universal health care, and then in 1995 with Hillary Clinton championing it, but then it being fought off, and then more recently with Bernie Sanders, we don't know how that's going to end up. But
right. So fair enough. It's not just a recent.
So I want to get to some comments on the live stream and then get to Moshe. So Chet said a while ago that poverty is a constant in the state/market system, we have to just abolish it or it will persist. Now, is he talking about abolishing poverty or abolishing the state market system? Is that you're voting for state market system?
That would be my vote. No, I think he's saying abolish poverty with a UBI.
All right,
I was thinking that too.
So we've got a divided
Depends on whether
opinion
he's
here.
a UBI
Yeah.
component, I think. Not sure.
Derek says, I suspect that UBI at pretty much any level will probably reduce wages for desirable work and raise wages for undesirable work. That makes sense. He also says, I think preference falsification is a good answer to what we were just talking about. Naturally, everyone prefers cash, but if it's socially unacceptable to ask for money and benefits, you ask for work and higher wages. I think that's definitely true, but that kind of begs the question: why is that the thing that's socially acceptable? Yeah.
I think it's related to the comment that I was trying to make before, which is that it seems, it's just kind of odd, but it seems like the way we talk about having basic living standards is via wages. And like when we say we want a higher minimum wage, what we mean is, and I agree that it's not being instantiated most efficiently, and it's interesting why we say it this way, but it seems like that's the way that we demand higher basic living standards, is like,
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess that goes to Alex's point, though. Like, it's this path dependence where, like, that's how we already get our money. So that is how we get more money, and so, like, we argue for that.
And I really like the example of health insurance because it followed a different path in different countries, depending on historical accident. Well, some countries went to government socialized healthcare, and some countries, like our country, thanks to labor negotiations, forced employers to provide health insurance for the workers. Yeah.
And in Japan, they actually have multiple private insurers, but they're not allowed to make a profit. They're a non-profit. They have to compete against each other, and they.
Why do they care?
Because. And there's like these regulations that if you have they have really cheap MRIs, so they just like $90 for MRIs instead of like $2,000 or whatever they have here.
Right, that's interesting.
Because the more that you use something, the cheaper it gets.
Like economy of scale. Interesting.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I wanted to sort of draw the connection between what Alex was saying, like, I feel like you were saying a minute ago, why is it through the labor movement? Why is it not just directly saying to the government, look, we want a UBI?
Mm-hmm.
And, yesterday Andrew Yang dropped out of the presidential race. Why did he not get more support? Or why? I guess things take time. Maybe we are in the middle of like a rapid rise in the popularity of the idea of the UBI, and we'll have one in a few years. That's plausible to me. But I think that part of the answer is that there are kind of like narratives that people have bought into. There's a kind of an ideology that is part of what holds this system together.
Yeah.
That stabilizes it, and part of that ideology sort of says, basically in different ways, like, yeah, we'd like you guys to be better off, but because of the economy, it just wouldn't work out.
Right.
I agree with that intuition. There also just seems to be, I think, and it begs the question of where this is from, this notion that if we gave people a universal basic income, well, it's like giving people welfare, and then we just get a bunch of welfare queens. And the implication there is like people will just be lazy, and they won't be any happier. They'll just be like a bunch of couch potatoes, and there's something inherently bad about that. I think that's part of the mentality. But.
Yeah, and Derek is saying on the live stream, in the past and to some extent still today, you can be penalized for being perceived as lazy. Asking for unconditional benefits may result in removal of your conditional benefits. So I think...
But it is it does raise the question of what gets considered that way. Because if we now like the GI Bill, but if they were worried about that then too, it's
I think it's at least partly rooted in the social incentives that we need to get anything done in a smaller group. right?
Yeah.
You don't want, you're trying to achieve something together. You don't want anyone to slack. We need contributions from everyone, right? That's true at the small scale.
Right.
It's not maybe true at the level of a large scale economy, but we still have these kind of moral intuitions that are reinforced through just cultural reinforcement.
And these are like still values that we want to like show to our friends. Like, our friends might want us, or like our employer might want us to be hardworking, and so like we tout that value.
Right, and that's true, but ultimately what we want from the economy is to be able to maximize our leisure. We want to maximize the extent to which people can be lazy welfare queens or whatever and receive benefit. If that's something that's achievable, if it's not necessary for those people to work in order to produce the benefit, then that's exactly what we want, right?
Optimal free ridership.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me try one. I'm not sure about this idea yet, but let me put it out there. I agree that if you have universal basic income, like it could create efficiency gains because there's more money flowing.
Sure.
So we agree on that. But here's a question: Are the industry tycoons better off? And here's one reason why they might not be, and I'm not sure about this, and maybe it's worth talking to, is it could be that now you've given all of the potential laborers so much more bargaining power that now, to the extent that they're still needed by the industry tycoons, the industry tycoons are stuck giving them so much higher wages that offsets the efficiency gains to the economy.
Yeah.
And so it could be that they very much don't like.
So I think the answer to that question is some businesses are going to lose and some businesses are going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And Alex's way of doing basic income takes that into account on a macroeconomic level, because he's increasing the basic, he's gradually increasing.
Right, and I agree that there will be efficiency gains, and so on a macro level, yeah, but the worry is that Bezos won't be better off, and so Bezos has a
so then he'll lobby against
push.
Yeah. So I think specifically people like Bezos will be better off. He's producing all the stuff.
Okay, I agree. What about Walmart?
Walmart, same thing.
Okay, so then who's not?
Bankers. Bankers are not better off.
Okay, we agree. Yeah, but they're obsolete anyways.
They've got lobbying power.
They do have lobbying power, and I think when the consumers are the ones with the money, then the way to profit is by providing benefits to consumers, providing goods and services for consumers. Yeah. So if your business model depends on, making bets on financial markets or whatever like that, you're not going to be able to profit as much under a basic income system. And that's partly because as we increase the basic income, we can rein in the financial sector. We don't need to print as much money through Wall Street and the private financial sector when the government is printing the money directly.
But hold on, let's go back to Bezos. Maybe I gave in too easily.
Yeah, sure.
So Bezos, is true that he's going to sell a lot more product. There's a lot more stuff being moved on Amazon. We agree on that. But to the extent that, so let's ignore automation for now.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe in the future that'll be solved and he won't need laborers. But to the extent that now he still depends on about 1 million laborers. Even if he could sell 5 times as much product, it could be that those 1 million laborers now have so much more bargaining power that he's stuck paying them more than 5 times as much.
I think you probably wouldn't end up in that situation, because if you take that to its logical conclusion, it would end up in higher prices for consumer goods, which is inflation. So you wouldn't set the basic income at a high enough level that it would have that much of an effect, right? So basically what we would be doing...
I mean, what if the main effect is it allows for more consumers, but now all the people who would have worked at Amazon no longer feel like they need to work. Because Amazon is one of the worst jobs, and it's fairly menial and it's boring.
I think Amazon would have to make some adjustments. They'd have to make their jobs maybe more appealing, pay a little bit more, automate more, get by with fewer workers, substitute things for labor. But at the end of the day, when you think about production in our economy, who's the most efficient? like Amazon is probably, you know,
They don't make stuff; they just move it around, right?
well, as I guess as part of the supply, they actually do make stuff now too, which is you know, something that people are having problems with. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of facilitating the supply chain and the flow of goods and services in the economy, you know, Amazon makes that a lot more efficient. So I would imagine that if you had a basic income, it wouldn't be the Amazons that would go out of business. It would be.
Well, I wasn't claiming they'd go out of business. I'm just worried that Bezos' bottom line is worse.
So I think what might happen is his stock prices are going to go down. Because the Amazon stocks are not just.
So now you're saying every Amazon stockholder has a reason to like fight against yen.
Yeah.
And then also Bezos has a reason to perhaps spew propaganda against basic income and instead push like, you know, other means of providing social services.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the answer to I forget your name. Nick's question.
And the question was.
Like, why don't people, or your like the
Or
question
why-
of like
why-
why are we not?
Why don't people organize and fight for basic income? Because Bezos will come back with propaganda saying, "Don't do that."
I'm suspicious that people foresee this. Like, I'm suspicious that Amazon knows that this effect would happen.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm actually suspicious of that too. Amazon doesn't think about basic income the way I do.
Yeah, I agree that like it's not about basic income, but I think it could be that capitalists for a while have been foreseeing the need to like not hand out free stuff to laborers because then they like have more bargaining power and.
I see, and that this has like decreased the degree to which, but that they don't like the labor movement forcing them to do stuff either, right? Like raise minimum wage, or so it's. I'm not sure which they would see as
Okay,
worse.
no, I agree.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it is an interesting question why we like try to tie it so much, and I guess I like Alex's solution that historically it made more sense and there's some stickiness.
Yeah. Okay, so we're getting to the end. I will finish by reading one more quote. Somebody to choose from. I guess I'll choose this one, and then we'll go around and get people's final thoughts. So this one is the class formulation. So the division between what do they say? The division between workers and the working class and the capitalists. So that class formulation necessarily defined trade unionism as the movement of the entire working class. The AFL asserted as a formal policy that it represented all workers, irrespective of skill, race, religion, nationality, or gender. But the national unions that had created the AFL in fact comprised only the skilled trades. Almost at once, therefore, the trade union movement encountered a dilemma: how to square ideological aspirations against contrary institutional realities. And then the next part starts getting into how there's a lot of racism and discrimination among the labor unions. Final thoughts on organized labor.
Yeah, well, this was a really interesting discussion. I don't know if I have like one thought, but I think it is interesting to think about what is now happening to this sort of bargaining power that we've been talking about. And I know we were taking automation off the table quite a bit in the thought experiments, but like with that, does that necessitate a shift to like the government being lobbied directly over some of these other tactics? If they are even still rooted in real bargaining power, I mean, who knows? They could also just be rooted in like stickiness at this point. I don't even know how much they connect to the actual need for workers. I guess that's another question that this raised for me. But interesting discussion.
Yeah, Steve.
No final thoughts.
Nick.
I wish we were this picture that I feel like a lot of our discussion was revolving around that the market kind of is going to tend to push workers until their backs are kind of against the wall. Makes me kind of worried that that either that there might not be. I want to maybe look forward to talking more about this and trying to figure it out. But it makes my intuition shift more toward this pessimistic picture that basic income that is still below that subsistence level will get eaten up by lower wages, and people will wind up with their backs up against the wall again. And if you go up any higher than that, that it won't be long. You basically hit inflation right away because things are pretty tight already. Like, a lot of work is being squeezed out of people now.
Yeah.
And that maybe there isn't that much room to like squeeze more
Okay.
goods out of the economy without more
Sorry.
work.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
Just saying. I'm probably just start thinking about next thought, and that like I feel like that there is a lot of that like we talk a lot about sort of like bullshit jobs, and I don't buy that as much as some people, but I think there's a lot of like inefficiently allocated labor, and so I'm much more optimistic about like if you let people do the things that they want to do, whether that's like a full on like everyone gets $50,000 and you can all do whatever you want, or even some of the marginal stuff. Like I'm not sure where that margin would have to be, but to allow people some more flexibility, I think there is a lot of space for more productive capacity. One thing that felt interesting about this conversation about the sort of race to the bottom was thinking about how like we talk about automation a lot, but sort of how the gig economy is like circumventing those labor movement protections, and so like that honestly feels more threatening to me than like this vague specter of automation as like it's like, okay, so maybe automation will push people out of jobs, but the gig economy feels like it keeps people trapped in this, like they're working constantly, but still not surviving. And it's much harder because like it's like, okay, so like all your friends are Uber drivers, but like you can't like band together against Uber in the same way that you can if like all of your friends are seamstresses. Which I mean, like, it's partly like a skill differential that like if all the seamstresses walk out, like you can't, like you're already employing most of the seamstresses, like you can't just find more, but like
you don't know all the other Uber drivers.
Yeah.
You can be like, hey guys, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that feels like more threatening. And so then it's like, okay, so then like what we talked about, like, well, shouldn't we just, or not shouldn't necessarily, but like couldn't we just like, why don't people just petition the government for things directly? And so that sort of interesting. Often what people are asking the government for is like regulations. Like, oh, okay, like we want Uber drivers to be classified as actual employees and not contractors, so that then they have to be paid like, like a certain minimum level, or like with like DoorDash. I guess it comes up less with Uber for wages, but like DoorDash, where it's like, oh, you can tip your your delivery person, but then the company will just take that tip out of the tip we were going to give them. So like they're getting the same amount of money, but like we profit off of your like tipping. But like with Uber, like, oh, like who's responsible for like insurance?
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's like DoorDash in a bunch of places that they're like, oh, so like we're guaranteeing like a basic minimum tip for our drivers. Like, that's really great of us. But like if you tip them, like, say we are guaranteeing them up to like a 20% tip, like if you tip them less than that, like we'll just take it out of like what we would have given them, because we're just giving them this like safety net. And so because you paid it, and so I guess this is a very awkward thing where we're like, fine, now I have to have cash on hand again to like essentially pay them under the table.
Yeah.
Because the drivers have like, baked that into their wage, and it's
that's really
in like the fine print. And so then it's like, people are like, I didn't know that until there's then some like,
Yeah.
Final thoughts, Marcia?
No, I think
All right, Richard.
well, in California, they actually have a law that Uber drivers are considered employees, but the companies are fighting against that. And also in like London, there has the same sort of thing.
Okay.
And well, with inflation and the UBI, in Kenya, with Give Directly, that it was reported a few months ago that the UBI is 15% of the entire GDP of the country, and that it only since there's so much untapped productivity, is 0.1% of inflation. And
That's interesting.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, certainly it's possible if you want to cause lots of inflation, you can find an amount of money that'll do that for you. But we're not necessarily close to that yet with basic income. To Nick's 2 points, or I guess it's 1 point. I'm going to make 2 points about it, which is that, I think as we ramp up the basic income, we're going to see aggregate wages decrease. We're going to see people's wages decrease. And I think that's that's a result of the fact that we're currently using wages to prop up consumer spending. We're stimulating the financial sector to create jobs and boost wages for people. I mean, that's a big part of it. And this is what you'd want. In an efficient labor market, the only purpose of wages is to provide an incentive for people to do the work. And as Derek was pointing out on the live stream, for the desirable jobs, higher basic income means you don't have to pay people nearly as much. And for undesirable jobs, maybe it means you have to pay people more. But on average, you'd expect wages to come down across everyone, because we don't have to use wages in this way anymore. Wages can just be an incentive mechanism for getting people to work. And what gives me optimism in thinking that we do have room for a lot of basic income, other than just looking around and seeing, it seems obvious that we have the resources to end poverty, you can look at the financial markets. You can look at, we have this business cycle that's caused by overstimulation of the financial sector. If we were close to, no, because then you're just substituting the basic income for the money that's created in the financial sector.
Yeah.
You're not just doing that because the money created in the financial sector tends to go more towards people who already have money and just a little bit leaks out to consumers. I feel like we have room for enough of a basic income to make people a lot better off, to be in a much better situation than we are now. As far as the organized labor goes, I think it would be great if we could figure out a way to break out of thinking of ourselves as workers and push for services from the government, like healthcare directly from the government and basic income directly from the government, and kind of decouple these things from the labor market, like I always talk about. So good discussion. Next week we're on Wednesday again, and we're going to be talking about what it would mean for the economy to have a natural rate of basic income, and what factors go into determining what that natural rate might be. Okay, thanks, guys.
Good discussion, Alex. Thanks, everyone.
I'm about to miss next week. I have church council, so.
Glad you could make it this week.